December 17, 1944. 5 American Sherman tanks sat in a frozen Belgian village, staring down a column of over 40 German Panther tanks that were supposed to be technologically superior in every way. What happened next became one of the most humiliating defeats in Panzer history, as elite SS crews watched their invincible tanks burn one by one at the hands of undermanned American crews they'd been told were inferior. But how did 5 outdated Shermans completely destroy the myth of German armored superiority and break the spirit of the most fanatical tank crews in Hitler's army? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. December 17, 1944. The Ardennes forest in Belgium sat frozen and quiet under a thick blanket of fog. Small villages dotted the landscape, their stone houses and narrow streets looking peaceful in the early morning darkness. But peace was about to shatter in a way that would change everything the German army believed about their mighty Panther tanks. The twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocheract stood in the path of Hitler's last desperate gamble. These small farming communities had narrow roads barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. Stone buildings lined these streets, their thick walls built centuries ago by Belgian farmers who never imagined tanks would roll through their quiet home. The villages sat at a crossroads that the German army needed to capture if they wanted to reach the port city of Antwerp and split the Allied forces in 2. Germany was dying, though many soldiers still believed they could win. Hitler had promised them a great victory in this winter offensive. He told them the Americans were weak, that their tanks were garbage, and that German engineering and willpower would crush the enemy and turn the tide of war. The Führer had scraped together his last reserves of tanks, fuel, and men for this attack. Every drop of gasoline was precious now. Every experienced tank crew was irreplaceable. But the propaganda machine kept churning out messages of certain victory. The German soldiers advancing through the fog that morning had been fed a steady diet of lies. They learned in training that American soldiers were cowards who would run at the first sign of real fighting. They were told that the American M4 Sherman tank was a death trap, so poorly designed that it would burst into flames the moment a German shell touched it. German crews called them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter, because they light up the first time, every time. The Panther tank, by contrast, was supposed to be invincible. Its thick frontal armor could bounce off most American shells. Its long 75mm gun could punch through a Sherman from over a mile away. On paper, 1 Panther equaled 5 Shermans. The math seemed simple. Staff Sergeant William McConaughey did not care about German math. He sat in his Sherman tank somewhere in those villages, part of the 741st Tank Battalion attached to the 2nd Infantry Division. McConaughey was not a superhero or an elite soldier. He was just an American kid who had been drafted, trained on tanks, and sent to Europe to do a job. His crew was tired. They had been fighting for months. Their Sherman tank had been hit before and repaired. They knew exactly how thin their armor was. They knew that a Panther could kill them from distances they couldn't even shoot back from. But they also knew things the Germans did not. The American tankers knew their Shermans backward and forward. They had trained together until they could load, aim, and fire faster than any Panther crew. They knew that their tank's weakness in armor could be turned into an advantage if they used speed and position correctly. They had learned to pick their shots, to aim for the weak spots on German tanks, to use buildings and hills for cover. Most importantly, they had gasoline in their tanks and shells in their racks. The supply trucks kept coming, bringing everything they needed to keep fighting. 5 Sherman tanks had been positioned in Krinkelt and Rusheract to help cover the retreat of American infantry. Just 5 tanks against what was coming. The crews could hear the rumble in the distance as the German column approached. Engine sounds carried through the fog. Lots of engines. The ground started to shake slightly. McConaughey and his men checked their guns one more time. They made sure their escape routes were clear. They positioned their tanks where they could shoot and then move quickly. They were not planning to slug it out face to face with Panthers. That would be suicide. The German Panzer crews rolled forward with confidence that cold morning. Many of them were SS soldiers, the most fanatical believers in Nazi ideology. They had been told they were the master race, that their equipment was the best in the world, and that the Americans were barely worth fighting. Some of these crews were experienced, having survived years of combat on the Eastern Front. Others were newer, but they had been trained to believe in the superiority of their tanks and their cause. As they moved through the fog towards the villages, they expected to brush aside whatever Americans stood in their way. The Panther tank was an impressive machine. It weighed 45 tons and its frontal armor was 80 millimeters thick, sloped to make it even stronger. The gun could fire a shell that traveled at 3,000 feet per second. Inside, the crew of 5 men sat in cramped positions, but they felt safe behind all that steel. The problem was that each Panther could only travel about 60 miles on a full tank of fuel, and fuel was running out across the German army. The other problem was that all the armor in the world didn't help if an enemy shot you from the side or rear, where the armor was much thinner. The first Panther rounded a corner in the village and met something it didn't expect. A Sherman was waiting, hidden behind a building. The American crew had their gun already aimed at exactly where a German tank would appear. The Sherman fired first. The shell hit the Panther in the side, where the armor was only 40 millimeters thick. The German tank exploded in a ball of fire. The crew barely had time to realize they were under attack. The German column behind that first Panther suddenly stopped. Confusion spread through the radio channels. How had a Sherman got the drop on them? Where was it firing from? The fog made it hard to see. The narrow village streets made it impossible to spread out. More Panthers pushed forward, but the Americans were ready. Another Sherman fired from a different position. Another Panther burst into flames. The German crews started to panic. This was not supposed to happen. They were supposed to be the hunters, not the prey. They had better tanks. They had superior training in Nazi ideology and tactics. But ideology does not stop a 75mm shell when it hits you in the weak spot. Training in political theory does not help when you cannot see your enemy through the fog and buildings. McConaughey's crew worked like a machine. The loader slammed shells into the gun. The gunner tracked targets and fired. The driver moved the tank to a new position as soon as they shot. The commander called out targets and kept everyone focused. They had done this drill 1,000 times. Every movement was automatic. They did not think about the odds or how many Panthers were out there. They just fought. More German tanks tried to push through. More German tanks died. The Panthers bunched up on the narrow roads, unable to use their superior range. The village buildings blocked their fields of fire. American crews shot them from windows, from behind corners, from positions the Germans could not see until it was too late. The invincible Panthers started to burn one after another. Black smoke rose into the winter sky. German crewmen who escaped their burning tanks could not believe what they were seeing. 5 American tanks were destroying dozens of Panthers. The confidence that the German crews had felt that morning was evaporating faster than the fog. Something was terribly wrong. Everything they had been told was turning out to be a lie. The Americans were not running. The Shermans were not easy targets. The battle was not going according to plan. And worst of all, some Panthers were running out of fuel right in the middle of the fight, their crews abandoning them before they even got hit. The mighty German war machine was breaking down in a frozen Belgian village, and 5 ordinary American tank crews were the ones breaking it. The German commanders had planned this attack for weeks. They studied maps that showed the villages would be lightly defended. Intelligence reports said the Americans were tired and stretched thin. The Panthers were supposed to roll through in less than an hour, smashing any resistance and pushing toward the bigger objectives beyond. Quick breakthrough, fleeing Shermans, collapsing American lines. That was the plan. Reality was turning out very different. The 5 American Shermans were not fleeing. They were fighting smarter than any German tactical manual had prepared for. McConaughey and the other tank commanders understood something fundamental that the German crews had forgotten in their years of relying on superior firepower. Position matters more than armor thickness. Surprise matters more than gun range. Coordination matters more than individual tank superiority. The Americans were using every advantage the villages gave them. One Sherman crew spotted a group of 3 Panthers trying to move down a side street. The American tank was hidden in a barn with a perfect view of the road. The crew waited silently as the first Panther rolled past, letting it go. Then the second Panther entered their kill zone. The gunner aimed carefully at the join between the turret and the hull, a weak point that every experienced tanker knew about. One shot. The Panther lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from the turret ring. The third Panther tried to reverse, but slammed into the Panther behind it. Both tanks were stuck, blocking the narrow street. 2 more shells from the American tank finished them both. 4 German tanks destroyed in less than a minute, and the Shermans simply backed out of the barn and moved to a new position before the Germans could react. The German radio channels filled with confused shouting. Officers were demanding to know what was happening. Crews were reporting Shermans everywhere, firing from every direction. But there were not Shermans everywhere. There were only 5. The Americans were just moving fast, shooting and relocating before the Germans could bring their superior guns to bear. The fog and the buildings turned the battlefield into a maze where the Panthers' advantages meant nothing. Another American crew demonstrated the value of knowing your enemy's weaknesses. They had positioned their Sherman behind a stone wall with only the gun barrel visible. When a Panther appeared, the American gunner did not aim for the thick frontal armor. That would have been useless. Instead, he aimed low, at the tracks and road wheels. The shell smashed the Panther's left track, leaving it unable to move. The German crew could still fire their gun, but they were a sitting duck. The American tank simply moved to a spot where the immobile Panther could not rotate its turret fast enough to target them, and put another shell into the engine compartment. The Panther burned. The American backup systems were working perfectly. When one Sherman started running low on ammunition, another tank moved up to take its place, while the first one pulled back to reload. Infantry soldiers were feeding information to the tank crews about German movements. Medics were ready to help wounded tankers. The whole operation worked like a well-oiled machine. Every piece supported every other piece. The Germans, by contrast, were falling apart. Panthers kept bunching up on the roads because there was nowhere else to go in the tight village streets. German doctrine called for tanks to spread out and use their range, but you cannot spread out when stone buildings 3 feet thick line both sides of a road that is only 15 feet wide. The Americans had turned the villages into a killing ground designed specifically to neutralize everything that made the Panther dangerous. It was brilliant in its simplicity. Then the fuel problem hit the Germans hard. Several Panthers simply stopped moving in the middle of the battle. Their crews had been told there was enough fuel for the operation, but the supply trucks had not made it through the traffic jams behind them. Some Panthers had been running their engines to stay warm during the night approach, burning precious gasoline. Now they sat dead in the streets, their crews climbing out and running for cover. The Americans shot up the abandoned tanks to make sure the Germans could not recover them later. The sight of Panthers burning without even being properly fought was devastating to German morale. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you were enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A German lieutenant managed to get a radio message through to his battalion commander. His voice was shaking. "They are picking us apart," he said. "We cannot see them until they fire. We cannot maneuver in these streets. We are losing tanks every minute." The commander ordered him to push through. "You have Panthers," the commander said. "They have Shermans. Do your duty." But the lieutenant knew the truth now. Having a Panther meant nothing if you could not use it properly. One American crew got a close look at just how good their training was compared to the Germans. A Panther rounded a corner and came face to face with a Sherman at a distance of less than 50 yards. Both tanks fired at almost the same instant. The German shell hit the Sherman's frontal armor and bounced off at an angle because the American driver had positioned the tank on a slight slope that increased the effective armor thickness. The American shell hit the Panther's gun mantlet and penetrated, killing the gunner and loader instantly. The Panther's remaining crew bailed out. The American crew sat in shocked silence for a moment, then backed their tank away and moved to help another position. Their training and positioning had just saved their lives. The battle was revealing something the Germans had refused to see. American tank crews were not inferior. They were not cowards. They were not poorly trained. They were professionals who understood combined arms warfare, tactical flexibility, and how to make the most of what they had. The Sherman was not a death trap when used correctly by a skilled crew. The Panther was not invincible when stripped of its advantages and forced to fight on American terms. Everything the German crews believed was burning along with their tanks in those Belgian streets. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber climbed out of his burning Panther with his uniform smoking and his hands shaking. He had commanded this tank for 8 months, surviving battles across France and into Belgium. The Panther had always protected him. Its thick armor had bounced off enemy shells dozens of times. But an American Sherman had just put a round through the side armor from a position Weber never saw until the impact threw him against the turret wall. Now his gunner was dead, his tank was burning, and American soldiers were running toward him with rifles ready. Weber expected to be shot. He had been told Americans sometimes executed SS prisoners. Instead, a young American soldier pushed him to the ground, checked him for weapons, and then called for a medic. Within minutes, an American medical corpsman was bandaging a burn on Weber's arm and giving him water. The medic worked quickly and efficiently, showing no anger or hatred. He treated Weber exactly the same way he had just treated a wounded American tanker. Weber watched in confusion. This was not what he had been taught to expect. They took him to a collection point behind the American lines. More German prisoners were there, some wounded, all looking defeated. Weber could see American tanks moving past, heading toward the fight. But what struck him was how organized everything seemed. Trucks were bringing up ammunition and fuel. Wounded men were being loaded into ambulances. Fresh tank crews were arriving to replace exhausted ones. An American officer was coordinating everything with a radio and a map, speaking calmly as if this were a training exercise. There was no panic, no chaos, just smooth, professional operation. Weber had been inside the German system long enough to know what chaos looked like. He had seen German supply columns stuck in traffic for hours. He had watched experienced crews get replaced by teenagers with 3 weeks of training. He had felt his own Panther running on fuels because fuel trucks couldn't get through. But here were the Americans, supposedly the inferior force, running their battle like a factory production line. Every piece moved when it was supposed to. Every need was met before it became critical. Weber had been inside the German system long enough to know what chaos looked like. He had seen German supply columns stuck in traffic for hours. He had watched experienced crews get replaced by teenagers with 3 weeks of training. He had felt his own Panther running on fuels because fuel trucks couldn't get through. But here were the Americans, supposedly the inferior force, running their battle like a factory production line. Every piece moved when it was supposed to. Every need was met before it became critical. Weber had been inside the German system long enough to know what chaos looked like. He had seen German supply columns stuck in traffic for hours. He had watched experienced crews get replaced by teenagers with 3 weeks of training. He had felt his own Panther running on fuels because fuel trucks couldn't get through. But here were the Americans, supposedly the inferior force, running their battle like a factory production line. Every piece moved when it was supposed to. Every need was met before it became critical. Weber had been inside the German system long enough to know what chaos looked like. He had seen German supply columns stuck in traffic for hours. He had watched experienced crews get replaced by teenagers with 3 weeks of training. He had felt his own Panther running on fuels because fuel trucks couldn't get through. But here were the Americans, supposedly the inferior force, running their battle like a factory production line. Every piece moved when it was supposed to. Every need was met before it became critical. Weber had been inside the German system long enough to know what chaos looked like. He had seen German supply columns stuck in traffic for hours. He had watched experienced crews get replaced by teenagers with 3 weeks of training. He had felt his own Panther running on fuels because fuel trucks couldn't get through. But here were the Americans, supposedly the inferior force, running their battle like a factory production line. Every piece moved when it was supposed to. Every need was met before it became critical. Weber had been inside the German system long enough to know what chaos looked like. He had seen German supply columns stuck in traffic for hours. He had watched experienced crews get replaced by teenagers with 3 weeks of training. He had felt his own Panther running on fuels because fuel trucks couldn't get through. But here were the Americans, supposedly the inferior force, running their battle like a factory production line. Every piece moved when it was supposed to. Every need was met before it became critical. Weber had been inside the German system long enough to know what chaos looked like. He had seen German supply columns stuck in traffic for hours. He had watched experienced crews get replaced by teenagers with 3 weeks of training. He had felt his own Panther running on fuels because fuel trucks couldn't get through. But here were the Americans, supposedly the inferior force, running their battle like a factory production line. Every piece moved when it was supposed to. Every need was met before it became critical. Weber had been inside the German system long enough to know what chaos looked like. He had seen German supply columns stuck in traffic for hours. He had watched experienced crews get replaced by teenagers with 3 weeks of training.
He had felt his own Panther running on fuels because fuel trucks couldn't get through. But here were the Americans, supposedly the inferior force, running their battle like a factory production line. Every piece moved when it was supposed to. Every need was met before it became critical. Weber had been inside the German system long enough to know what chaos looked like. He had seen German supply columns stuck in traffic for hours. He had watched experienced crews get replaced by teenagers with 3 weeks of training. He had felt his own Panther running on fuels because fuel trucks couldn't get through. But here were the Americans, supposedly the inferior force, running their battle like a factory production line. Every piece moved when it was supposed to. Every need was met before it became critical. Weber had been inside the German system long enough to know what chaos looked like. He had seen German supply columns stuck in traffic for hours. He had watched experienced crews get replaced by teenagers with 3 weeks of training. He had felt his own Panther running on fuels because fuel trucks couldn't get through. But here were the Americans, supposedly the inferior force, running their battle like a factory production line. Every piece moved when it was supposed to. Every need was met before it became critical. Weber had been inside the German system long enough to know what chaos looked like. He had seen German supply columns stuck in traffic for hours. He had watched experienced crews get replaced by teenagers with 3 weeks of training. He had felt his own Panther running on fuels because fuel trucks couldn't get through. But here were the Americans, supposedly the inferior force, running their battle like a factory production line. Every piece moved when it was supposed to. Every need was met before it became critical. Weber had been inside the...
An older American sergeant sat down near Weber and lit a cigarette. He offered one to Weber, who took it gratefully. They sat in silence for a moment, then the sergeant spoke in broken German. "Your tank, very good machine. But machine is nothing without fuel, without training, without support." He gestured to the organized activity around them. "War is not about best tank. War is about all the things together working right." Weber nodded slowly. He understood now. The Panther was an excellent tank, but it was part of a system that was collapsing. The Sherman was a decent tank, but it was part of a system that worked. In the end, the system mattered more than the individual piece. Germany had built beautiful weapons and surrounded them with lies, shortages, and fanaticism. America had built practical weapons and surrounded them with training, supplies, and coordination. The outcome had been inevitable. Weber had just been too blinded by propaganda to see it until 5 Shermans had burned that blindness away along with 40 Panthers. Friedrich Weber returned to Germany in the spring of 1945. The train carrying released prisoners crawled through a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Cities that had once stood proud were now piles of broken stone and twisted metal. Factory chimneys stood alone like gravestones, marking where buildings used to be. The forests were full of stumps where trees had been cut down for firewood. Everything was gray and dead and silent except for the wind blowing through empty windows. Weber carried almost nothing physical from his time as a prisoner. The Americans had given him back his personal items when they released him, but there was not much. A watch that had stopped working, a photograph of his family that he was not sure he would find alive. What he carried in his mind was much heavier. He carried the memory of American abundance, even in war. He carried the knowledge that everything he had fought for was built on lies. He carried the understanding that came from watching 5 Sherman tanks destroy the myth he had believed in. The train stopped at what was left of Hamburg. Weber got off and started walking toward his neighborhood. He passed women digging through rubble, looking for anything useful. Children with hollow eyes watched him from doorways. Old men sat on broken walls staring at nothing. No one asked him about the war. No one wanted to know if they had fought well or bravely. Everyone just wanted to know if he had any food. He did not. Weber's apartment building was still standing, which made it one of the lucky ones. Half the buildings on his street were just foundations and rubble. He climbed the stairs slowly, afraid of what he would find. His wife Anna opened the door before he could knock. She had heard his footsteps and recognized them. They held each other without speaking for a long time. She was much thinner than he remembered. Everyone was thin now. His children gathered around him. They looked at their father like he was a stranger, which he supposed he was after 2 years away. His son Karl was 12 now, old enough to ask questions. "Did we fight well, father? Did our tanks win battles?" Weber looked at the boy and struggled to find words. How could he explain that winning individual battles meant nothing when you were losing the war? How could he tell his son that their superior tanks had been beaten by enemy tanks they had been taught to mock? Anna had saved a potato to cook for his homecoming. 1 potato split between 5 people. She apologized that there was not more. Weber thought about the American POW camp where they served pork chops and canned peaches. He thought about the trucks that brought fresh food every day to American soldiers. He thought about the chocolate bar given to a wounded prisoner. The contrast was so sharp it hurt to think about. That night, Karl asked his father to tell him about the tank battles. The boy had grown up on propaganda about invincible German armor. Weber sat his son down and told him the truth. He told him about crinkled Rocherath. He told him about 5 American tanks destroying 40 Panthers. He told him about running out of fuel in the middle of a battle while American supply trucks kept rolling. Karl's face showed confusion, then disbelief, then something like betrayal. "But they told us we had the best tanks," the boy said quietly. Weber put his hand on his son's shoulder. "We did have good tanks, Karl, but we did not have fuel for them. We did not have enough trained crews. We did not understand our enemy. And most importantly, we believed lies about who they were." He paused, choosing his words carefully. The Americans were not inferior. They were not cowards. They were just better prepared for the kind of war we were fighting. And we were too proud to see it until it was too late. The weeks after his return were hard. Weber tried to find work, but there was almost no work to find. The factories were bombed. The offices were destroyed. Everyone was scrambling just to survive. He stood in line for hours to get ration cards that provided barely enough food to live on. He watched his children grow weaker from hunger. The Germany he had fought for was dead, and its corpse was starving. But something was changing in Weber's mind. He refused to romanticize what had happened. When old soldiers gathered to talk about the glory days of the Panzer forces, he stayed silent. When someone mentioned how Germany had been betrayed or stabbed in the back, he walked away. He had seen the truth with his own eyes. There was no betrayal, there was no bad luck. There was just a system built on lies facing a system built on practical reality, and reality had won the way it always does. He started writing his thoughts in a small notebook Anna had found for him. The words came slowly at first, then faster. At crinkled Rocherath, 5 American tanks taught 40 German tanks a lesson that no military academy could teach. Wars are won not by the best machines, but by the best prepared men. We thought our armor made us invincible. They proved that our arrogance made us blind. In captivity, I learned more about war than in 4 years of fighting. I learned that we never understood our enemy, and that ignorance cost us everything. Years later, when Germany began to rebuild, Weber made sure his children understood what he had learned. He told them never to believe anyone who said their enemies were inferior. He told them that propaganda and pride were more dangerous than any weapon. He told them that the real lesson of the war was not about tanks or battles, but about the cost of believing comfortable lies instead of facing hard truths. The battle at Crinkled Rocherath had lasted only a few hours, but it had destroyed more than 40 Panther tanks. It had destroyed Friedrich Weber's faith in everything he had been taught, and in the end, that destruction had been necessary. Only by having his illusions burned away could he see clearly enough to help build a Germany that would never make the same mistakes again. The 5 Sherman tanks had done more than win a battle. They had opened the eyes of at least one German soldier to the reality that his side had spent years trying to hide. And that truth, painful as it was, had set him free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you'll want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.